So because of the fact that I'm not feeling very well, I forgot to turn my microphone on for that first part that I just shared with you. So you saw a lot of pantomime, a lot of things where I'm sure you were reading lips. The big thing is that I was saying, and then we have dogs that do nutty things downstairs. So that's something I'm going to have to remedy as well. Sebastian, stop it. Stop it. Anyway, if you're not feeling well, stay home. Don't come to the class. You know the difference if you're just kind of feeling a little down, if you've got a little sniffle, whatever that may be. But if you're sick, stay home. That's the beauty of these classes, is the fact that you can watch these later. You can catch up. Staying up clearly is the best way to do things, but I get it. When you're not feeling well, it's like, what's the point? And I understand that. I mean, I really do. So so there's that. I apologize about the missing sound there earlier. God. So going back where we were yesterday, I want to go back just a little bit here. I wanted to the weather, because I kind of gave this and I referenced the VFR weather pyramid that we have done in previous classes, but I failed to show it. The illustration here in figure 3-9 here in chapter 3, and by the way, I also, and again, I just looked down and I happened to notice that I put chapter 4 instead of chapter 3, and chapter 4, I believe, is where the regulations are in big blue, I think. But I put that down by mistake. I meant chapter 3, so, one of the things here, you can look at this chart and it shows, the different airspaces. It shows what the weather minimums are for aircraft here as well. Excuse me. And you can look at this and you can certainly glean the same information as you can from the VFR weather pyramid of Rod Machado. But I think it's important to just kind of review this here as well. I think it's actually visual genius of what he has done. Remember, this is VFR weather information. This, of course, does not include Class Alpha airspace, which begins at 18,000 feet. It's everything 17,999 feet and below. And this kind of covers all of this information here for you as well. I'm leaving this up so that you can certainly pause this and draw this for yourself. This goes back to another element that I am philosophically opposed to handouts. And so as you draw these, you can kind of see what we're talking about. Clearly here, the letters indicate the various types of airspace, that those are clouds. Remember, the inside the cloud, that has to do with the visibility. So, Class Golf airspace, 1 statute mile visibility, and you have to be 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontal. And then with the Class G, remember, it doesn't go up very high there as well. So, yeah, so that's, this is the Rod Machado pyramid. So you can look at that. Another thing that the text does is that it kind of gives it to you here verbally, and that's, I say verbally. From a text standpoint, you can see that there, and just kind of reread. Special VFR, remember, you have to have permission for special VFR, and you also know where on sectional charts to look to see if Class Bravo or Class Charlie airspace even offers special VFR, because in some cases it will say no SVFR if there's no special VFR. And that special VFR is a tool of visual flight rules that allows you to kind of get a little bit below the types of weather outlined in the basic VFR weather minima to get you in and to get you landing. Yeah, goes through the seat belts. Just remember the seat belts. Operating near other aircraft, remember the right of way. Also remember that the right of way also is it varies from the other types of aircraft perhaps that you may have out there in your airspace. So you can read those and just kind of review what those are. Remember, there are speed limitations here that we have below 10,000 feet MSL. So just kind of remember where those are. Remember what the the classifications, what they mean, and with regard to the speed limits. Also, you have minimum safe altitudes that you have. Remember that in uncongested areas, wide open spaces, is that you have to stay 500 feet AGL here over the ground, but when you're out over the desert, over open water with things like that, you can go lower. You just have to stay at minimum of 500 feet away from persons or things out there. So, yeah. So there's that. And I think that just tells you what I was talking about. Guys, I apologize. I just slept so poorly last night. I'm just a mess. Anyway, I want to review here these cruising altitudes. Remember that as we look at these altitudes, if we think about these as sort of a kind of a compass rose, I guess, if you will, just kind of remember how this works. So, for instance, up here under the VFR, you've got the 0 and 179 over here on the right side, and then you have 180 to 359 over here on the left, with this kind of bisecting this. The big thing here is to remember this is magnetic. So this has to do with your magnetic course. So your magnetic track along the ground. That is what we're looking at here. This will normally also correlate with Victor Airways. Victor Airways are established off of VORs. VORs, those radials, are laid out magnetically. So if they have been adjusted and calibrated properly, then this is how you determine your altitude for during your cruise. So any time when you're more than 3,000 feet AGL, this is when you have to be at a particular cruising altitude. Remember WEO. West is even, east is odd. And with VFR, +5. So in this case, if you're at sea level, cruising altitudes on the easterly side of this, of this compass, where you're flying, this direction, let's say, and you have a heading here that you're flying of, let's call it 085. Well, if you're flying there at 085, then you're flying east. West is even, east is odd, so I need to be at an odd altitude +500 feet. So with this, you could be at 5,500 feet, 7,500 feet, 13,500 feet, whatever that's going to be. On the west side, with a westerly magnetic course here, If your magnetic course, and I said heading earlier, I don't mean heading, I mean your course, your magnetic course. If your magnetic course over here is, let's call it 230, well, then that's going to be even. So you're going to be at 8,500, 12,500, 14,500, whatever that's going to be, okay? And remember, it has to do with magnetic course. The same thing here is going to apply, well, if I can apply it. For IFR, the difference is going to be, whoops, the difference is going to be that, well, goodness, come on. The difference is going to be that with this, there's no plus 500 feet. So it's going to be on the rounded to those thousands. So a magnetic course of 080 is going to be at 5,000 feet, 7,000 feet, 13,000 feet, because it'll be odd. A magnetic course of 270 is going to give you, 4,000 feet, 8,000 feet, 14,000 feet, something even, okay? So, yeah, there's that. Wouldn't this be a great video, just to publish? I'm so entertaining. We covered this here again, the acronyms for a lot of the primarily IFR type conditions. MEAs, minimum en route altitudes, minimum obstruction clearance altitudes, and kind of know the difference. The MEA, that's going to get you up where you are going to have navigational reception and you're going to clear any obstacles. The MOCA is going to clear you of the obstacles. However, you may not have the ground-based radio navigation guidance that you thought you might have. There's going to be a period in there where you can, and in this particular case, most certainly will, lose your VORs because remember, VOR is line of sight. That's kind of how that reception piece works. So if the box in your airplane cannot see that station, you're not going to get the signal. So that's going to be a thing that you kind of have to be aware of here. Then you have MCAs, minimum crossing altitudes. So at this point, you may have a fix that's going to be established above, in this case, a VOR, and you have an MEA of 6,000 feet, but you have to cross that particular fix at 9,000 feet, and that will establish you up to the next level of the MEA at 13,000 feet. The reason that these things are important is because you see this a lot in our part of the world as you're flying from the flatlands up to the high granite. So those are going to be things that you really have to pay attention to, is those minimum crossing altitudes of these fixes. I've got to figure out why this thing is going so slow. This was happening this morning, and I'm not sure what the heck is going on here with these things. But this goes in here. This talks about your altimeter settings, kind of why we switch to 29.92 on our altimeter settings when we're in Class Alpha airspace. And it talks to you about that. We've talked about that before. The course to be flown, we've talked about that. Takeoffs and landings, you can look at the takeoff minimums here. It's kind of interesting because the takeoff minimums for Part 91, like people like us, they don't necessarily really apply. But my philosophy is that, the big boys, all of the, the 135, 121, 125, all of those guys, they do have a certain minima that will keep them on the ground. And so even though that in Part 91 we don't have those restrictions, my way of thinking is, if Boeing ain't going, I ain't going. It's kind of one of those things. And yeah, so there you go. Instrument approaches, we'll talk about those here. Again, this goes back through some of the other approaches and what some of the rules and regulations are for these. And it'll be a review for you on what applies to what. Remember, there are actually 11 different things that you as pilot in command must be able to visually spot before you can descend below the DA of an approach. Most of the times that you get down to your decision altitude with a precision approach, and also just kind of remember decision altitude, DA, DH, those are primarily talking about the precision approaches, whereas MDA, that's going to be a non-precision approach. So you have the DA, which is going to be decision altitude or decision height in DH, versus a minimum descent altitude of an MDA for a non-precision approach. So when we're looking at these precision approaches, remember that in most cases, a precision approach will get you down to 200 feet off the deck on your approach. In order for you to execute that approach, you must make out the airport and have the runway at 200 feet, or you also have to at least have, if you can see the approach lighting system, that will allow you to descend an additional 100 feet, okay? And that's going to be a thing that will get you down to 100 feet off the deck. But you've got to be able to see that. And in order for you to land, again, you have to be able to identify one of these things here, there's 11 of these different things for you to be able to actually land that airplane and not execute a missed approach. Okay. I am struggling, people. I am struggling. I am looking here. And I apologize, I was distracted because it's just such a long story. I'm not even gonna. We have a problem with Sebastian, our 11-year-old golden retriever. And so normally I put the dogs away whenever I'm doing these broadcasts. This one, however, I did not, and I'm ruing the decision to not do that. But I just, he's having problems, so. You can look here and you can review what has to happen here if you have certain failures here. For instance, if you lose radio communications, kind of understand what has to happen there should you have a radio failure. Complying with ATC clearances, a review of the ATC light signals. Of course, it depends on if you're on the ground or in the air. The rules for aerobatic flight. So again, it's this, you've got to be above 1,500 feet AGL. It's kind of the big one. And that's kind of your aviation regulations. Now, the thing about the aviation regulations is that as I mentioned before, the questions here at the end of the chapter for these things, especially the regulations section, these would be great for you to go over and review on these, because it kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of wakes up the, you know, the information in your head, kind of dusts off the cobwebs, you know, for information that you've covered those many months ago, just to kind of prepare here for what's coming here with the commercial stuff. So that's why we do the VFR and IFR review before we get into the commercial, because that commercial stuff has so much of that stuff in it as well. So there's that. We're going to press on here to beginning the portion here of aerodynamics. I'm trying to say if I have said the word enough today. I think so. Forces acting on an airplane. The review portion of this here again, just remember lift, weight, thrust, drag. Understand the lift to drag ratio here. These are things that we've covered. We talk about weight versus mass. Some will say mass, some will say gravity. I prefer weight, primarily because when we begin our discussion, or the review discussion in this case, on weight and balance, we have more continuity there with what we're talking about there. So it's not even just a matter of the weight of the aircraft, it's where that weight is distributed in the aircraft itself. And so those are why when we talk about weight and balance, we break those up. We don't just say weight and balance like it's all just one thing, because it's not. So that's one of the reviews. Airflow and airfoils. You can take a look here at these first two paragraphs. You'll see here that we have you know, we know that Bernoulli is the one that most people think about when they talk about lift of an aircraft, but to really explain lift, you really kind of have to you got to get Newton involved in the equation. You've got to get Magnuson involved in the equation. So it's sort of the shorthand explanation. We use Bernoulli, but there's more to it than that. And we do get into that more once we get to the commercial side of things. Airflow and the airfoil, the review of laminar flow, understand what all of the primary and secondary control systems on the airplane are for. This is the part here when we start talking here about, you know, the airflow, especially when it's flowing around a sphere type of a thing, that this is sort of what we want to talk about. The Coanda effect, we'll talk about that more with the in the commercial side, but again, the Newton's third law also comes into play here as well. Energies and pressures. We talk about the differences between potential and kinetic energies. I think you know what those are here, but it's a good review here to talk about this and why you know, altitude is our friend. We kind of refer to, we kind of talk about the fact that speed is life and altitude is life insurance. And there's a reason for that, is because, you know, any time that we have an issue with an airplane, it's always good to be able to exchange altitude for airspeed should we need it. And it's one of the reasons why, you know, if I'm given the choice, I will always choose to fly on the higher side of anything else, just in the event of some engine failure that might happen. So you can read that. This again is just review. I do want you to take special note this time here when we look at dynamic pressure and this formula. This is going to come up here in probably about 6 weeks when we start getting into more advanced aerodynamics in the commercial class. So just keep that in mind. Bernoulli, again, we've talked about this also ad nauseum here. Bernoulli and his Venturi effect and the study in pressure differential. Dynamic versus static pressures. you can look at this here again. Now it goes into lift and thrust and airspeed. Again, review, review, review. Different types of airfoils, kind of how they work, why they work. Airfoil shapes, knowing that most aircraft, especially training aircraft, are going to be a cambered airfoil, a symmetrical airfoil. This is going to be something that you'll find in aircraft that their mission requires greater maneuverability, but just understand the give and take. In a cambered airfoil, this is one where you're going to have more stability and probably less performance. This one you're going to have more performance but less stability. The big thing is understanding that when you look at just these basic principles of lift, weight, thrust, and drag, is that any time that you design something to get more out of one side, you're giving up something over here on this side. You know that there's one time when you have equilibrium, is when you're in steady, level, unaccelerated flight. Any other time that you alter that equation, in order to gain something over here, you have to give up something over here. And that's just sort of the way that it all works. So you just have to know that as you make these decisions with regards to either design or performance or mission, whatever that may be, to know this is what you're having to give up in order to accomplish that mission. So just bear that in mind. Camber, we can go back to Orville and Wilbur with regard to camber. Understand what the camber is, the chord line, mean camber. That'll come back to you here. Aerodynamic forces. Again, we look at Bernoulli. We talk about the differences here with regards to pressure differential. A lot of people sort of, assume that the reason that an airplane flies is because of the fact that they're getting some form of impact pressure underneath the lower portion of that wing surface, and they don't really have an understanding of the lifting action created by the pressure differential flowing over a cambered surface versus just that dynamic impact air that's hitting the wing from down below. There is some of that's happening, to be sure, but it's not sufficient to create lift. Again, we talk more about that on the more advanced aerodynamics when we get there on the commercial side of things. Relative airflow, and when we look at this, chord line, angle of attack, just kind of remember what all of that is. Remember, and this is something too that conceptually sometimes confuses people, is to say there's sometimes confusion with regard to the pitch attitude of an airplane with the angle of attack of the airfoil, because as you're transitioning between certain phases of flight, you have a certain time when you're going from level flight to a climb, let's say. Well, you have this initial area right here between this transition from the time that you add power and begin a climb. And so you have that portion here, that transition, where the rules kind of don't apply the same way. Because once you're established in that climb, then clearly your relative airflow is then going to be different than it would be if you're just beginning that transition between level flight and a climb. Same could be said for a descent. And that's what they're showing you here in this illustration in 4-25 and 4-26. Know the difference between dihedral and angle of incidence. Where does the center of pressure go given the angle of attack? And understanding sort of what happens here is that your center of pressure, as your angle of attack increases, moves closer to the leading edge of that airplane until that point where you reach your critical angle of attack. Then your center of pressure will slide back to the back half, or depending upon the actual camber of the airfoil here, where you just really begin to lose that lift. So there's that. The critical angle of attack in most aircraft is going to be that 16-degree mark is where you will reach that critical angle of attack. It may be a degree or two north or south of that 16 degrees for a particular aircraft, but generally speaking, that's sort of what we look at is that 16-degree mark for the critical angle of attack. Wing contamination, we'll discuss this more when we talk about icing and frost, things like that. But any contaminant that sort of prevents the laminar flow over an airplane, we talk about the fact that a clean airplane is a fast airplane, and it's quite literally true because of the fact that the airplane wants to be slippery, and the more slippery it is, the better the airplane's going to perform. And so if you've got a bug-encrusted airplane, you're going to lose some knots. You just are. So it's not even just a performance element, but you also have a safety element there as well, because with all of those bugs all over the leading edge of your aircraft and possibly even extending upward toward the cambered area of your wing, then now you're a test pilot. Because I can promise you that these men and women who test these aircraft for certification, they don't go out there with nasty looking airplanes. These airplanes are normally brand new. They normally have new engines. They're normally super clean. And that's where these numbers come from. If you have contaminants on the wing, you're a test pilot, and probably not on the side of that equation where it's going to be, you know, a lot of fun. I'm not going to suggest it won't be exciting, but it's really not where you want to be. So, you know, keep that machine clean. Drag, this is that force that opposes thrust. Here, remember the different types of drag that we have. My goodness. We talk about the total drag being the sum of the induced and parasite drag or parasitic drag. So remember that on the parasite drag, there are several different types of parasite drag. Skin friction, form drag, interference drag. Just review what these are here as well. And then on induced drag, well, we'll get past all of these things because you'll go through here and you'll figure this out. Remember that on parasite drag, the faster you're going, the higher the parasite drag. The more all of those things like skin friction and form, you start paying a penalty for those the faster that you go. And it becomes a point where you're having to pay so much for that increased speed with regards to either a bigger engine and greater fuel consumption that at some point it just becomes you know, kind of a losing effort for any form of efficiency that you have. Induced drag, remember that is induced by the pilot. That's when the pilot then changes the angle of attack and creating drag on the airframe based on the angle of attack. We look at vortices here also, and so you can look at the wingtip vortices, these things that kind of happened. And just remember that the vortices created off this airplane can also be dangerous. You'll note the angle of attack here, and you'll also notice that with induced drag, the actual drag component becomes less the faster that you're going, because the faster you're going, the more you're flying a flatter airplane, and your angle of attack is going to be relatively minimum with that. And so that's where you wind up with less induced drag. Wing design, high aspect ratio versus low aspect ratio. Our diamonds definitely are an example of high aspect ratio wings like you might find on a glider, and versus low aspect ratio wings that you might find on like a jet fighter. You know, again, for everything like this, you gain something here, but you lose something here. And that's sort of the same thing that happens here with this wing design. The one thing that I want to show you here on figure 4-42 is just this reminder, is that you're going to find this area here where these two lines of parasite drag and induced drag cross at this point. And this is a point here that when you look at the total drag of this aircraft, this is that point where you're going to meet this minimum drag part. And this minimum drag part is where within a couple of knots that you will find your best glide speed. And so that's you know, that point about where this comes from. We look at this more in depth on the commercial side of things here, certainly. You can look at this, the lift drag ratio. This is something else that we go over more in depth here in about 6 weeks or so with this. And again, lift drag versus angle of attack. You can see these here, the angles of attack here for given airspeeds. And these are going to be the things that we see here. And you look at these lines and you look at these vectors, because the vectors here are also showing, the difference of effect in where you may be. This one is showing basically the angle of attack versus a given airspeed. So we'll pick this up here with wing flaps on our next broadcast. Okay, so there you go. Again, I apologize for all of this, but I'm just tickled that you're not in the same room with me, because that's just, nobody needs that. Thank you very much, and God, I keep saying I'm just such an idiot. I will try to end this here. This is always the entertaining part, because anytime that my phone does something goofy, it keeps me from actually shutting off the broadcast, and I've got to get that figured out, because that's just intolerable. So, thank you very much. Pick this up here on Wing Flaps.